He was ruthless. She was relentless. Daniel Wolfe, the cold-hearted billionaire, built his empire on power and control, until betrayal nearly destroyed him. Olivia Hart, the sharp-tongued woman who refused to back down, was the only one who saw the cracks beneath his perfect facade. When a corporate scandal erupts, forcing them into an uneasy alliance, the war between them turns into something neither expected: trust, desire, love. But can two people who've spent their lives guarding their hearts truly let go? Where are you watching from? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to hear more stories that stir your soul. The boardroom of Wolfe Enterprises was a battlefield. Tension hung in the air, thick as a storm cloud, pressing down on every executive seated around the long, polished table. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The only sound cutting through the silence was the sharp, clipped voice of Daniel Wolfe, the formidable CEO whose reputation for ruthlessness was nearly as legendary as his business empire. "This," Daniel growled, slamming a thick stack of reports onto the mahogany surface, "is an embarrassment." His piercing gray eyes swept across the room, each glance a silent accusation. Millions poured into this project. And what do we have to show for it? Absolutely nothing. His voice was dangerously calm, the kind of calm that sent shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned executives. A middle-aged man, James Dillard, swallowed hard. He had been with the company for years, had weathered Daniel's relentless pursuit of perfection more times than he could count. But this was something else entirely. "Sir, we—" "Don't," Daniel snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. His jaw tightened, his expression like carved stone. "Do not give me excuses, James. We don't hope for success, we create it. And yet, here I am, looking at a quarterly loss that shouldn't even exist." The room remained silent. No one wanted to be the next target of his wrath. The stakes were too high, and Daniel Wolfe was not a man who tolerated failure. No one, except Olivia Hart. Seated at the far end of the table, Olivia had watched the exchange with arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had been with Wolfe Enterprises for 3 years, long enough to know that Daniel's temper was a force of nature, but today, something about it felt different. He wasn't just angry, he was seething. And yet, beneath all that fury, Olivia saw something else: desperation. She straightened, her voice clear, firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Wolfe, this isn't just about numbers." A sharp inhale rippled through the room. All eyes turned to her as if she had just made a terrible mistake. Maybe she had. Daniel's gaze snapped to her like a predator spotting its prey. A flicker of something dark, annoyance, maybe even amusement, crossed his face. "Oh," he said, voice laced with sarcasm. "Do enlighten me, Miss Hart." Olivia met his stare head on, refusing to be intimidated. "This failure isn't because people didn't work hard enough. Maybe the problem isn't just the profit margins. Maybe it's because we pushed too hard without considering the people involved." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was some kind of anomaly. "People," he repeated, his tone mocking. "You think I should prioritize emotions over results, over billions in revenue?" "I think," Olivia said, keeping her voice steady, "that a company that only chases profit without valuing the people who make it possible is doomed to fail. Eventually." A muscle in Daniel's jaw twitched. He let out a slow, controlled breath before leaning forward, resting his hands on the table. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow even more chilling. "Let me make something clear," he said, each word deliberate. "We don't exist to make people feel comfortable. We exist to dominate the market. If you want to run a charity, Miss Hart, I suggest you look elsewhere." A tense silence followed. Olivia clenched her fists under the table, but said nothing more. She had made her point. Whether he chose to listen was his problem, not hers. Daniel straightened, his patience wearing thin. "This meeting is over," he announced. "I expect a real solution on my desk by tomorrow morning. Not excuses." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, his mind still boiling with frustration. Outside the boardroom, the hallway was empty, save for the distant hum of office chatter. His polished shoes clicked against the sleek marble floor as he walked, his thoughts racing. The meeting had been a disaster. The numbers didn't lie. If the company didn't bounce back fast, even his reputation as a business genius wouldn't save him. His temples throbbed. He needed a moment. Just 1 second to clear his head. Turning the corner, he spotted the restrooms ahead. Without a second thought, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was slightly cooler, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of his anger. He walked toward the sink, rolling up his sleeves, exhaling slowly. Then, a sound. A muffled sniffle. Daniel's movements halted. His sharp eyes darted to the farthest corner of the restroom, and that's when he saw her. A woman, curled up on the floor, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her clothes were wrinkled, slightly torn, faint traces of dirt smudged across her exposed skin. Dark strands of hair fell over her face, obscuring her features, but the slight trembling of her shoulders told him everything. She was crying. She hadn't noticed him yet. Daniel frowned, his mind quickly trying to make sense of the situation. What was she doing here? Was she a janitor? No. Her attire, though worn, wasn't a uniform. He cleared his throat. The sound made the woman jolt. Her head snapped up, and for the first time, Daniel saw her face, big hazel eyes filled with fear and unshed tears, a streak of dirt across her cheek, lips slightly parted in shock. She looked fragile, vulnerable. But there was something else beneath that fear. Something defiant. "What?" Daniel started, but the woman scrambled to her feet, pressing herself against the wall as if expecting him to attack. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaky but defensive. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "I should be asking you that." The woman's breath hitched. She quickly looked around, her face paling. Then, realization dawned in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're not supposed to be in here." Daniel frowned. What the hell was she talking about? Then he turned his head slightly and saw the sign on the door behind him. Women's Restroom. For the first time in a long time, Daniel Wolfe was speechless. Daniel Wolfe rarely found himself at a loss for words, but as he stood in the women's restroom, staring at the woman pressed against the tiled wall like a cornered animal, his mind momentarily blanked. Her hazel eyes were wide, darting between him and the sign on the door behind him, realization hitting her like a tidal wave. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "You're not supposed to be in here." Daniel frowned, glancing over his shoulder, and there it was. The sign, clear as day. Women's Restroom. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. Then, as if a switch flipped, the woman straightened, crossing her arms over her chest, despite the slight tremble in her hands. "You should leave," she said, voice steadier now, edged with something sharp. Defiance, maybe. Daniel should have left. He had no business being here. And yet, he didn't move. His gaze swept over her, taking in the torn sweater, the faint dirt smudges on her jeans, the way she stood with her back against the cold tile, like she was bracing herself for a fight. She looked exhausted, desperate. But she didn't look weak. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone even but firm. She let out a sharp breath, as if steeling herself. I should be asking you the same thing. Daniel arched a brow. I think we both know who I am. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Annoyance, maybe. Disdain. Yeah, she muttered. Unfortunately, Daniel ignored the jab. So? He pressed. Who are you? She hesitated. A second too long. Olivia, she finally said. Olivia Hart. The name was familiar, and then it clicked. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his gaze. You used to work here. Her jaw tightened. Yeah, until last week. Daniel studied her, calculating. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it either. A strange feeling curled in Daniel's chest. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or irritation. Maybe both. That still doesn't explain why you're in here. Her chin lifted slightly. I was sitting, she said simply. Sitting, Daniel repeated, voice flat. Olivia exhaled sharply, running a hand through her dark hair. Look, I was supposed to get my last paycheck today, she admitted. Her told me there were delays. They wouldn't give me a straight answer. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. I've been looking for another job all week. No luck. I was tired. I needed somewhere to sit for a minute. Daniel crossed his arms. And the women's restroom was your first choice? A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. When you don't have an office, a house, or even money for a cup of coffee, you take what you can get. Something flickered in Daniel's expression, too quick to catch. He should have walked away. Should have told security to handle it. But for some reason, he didn't. Instead, he said, "So you're homeless." The bluntness of it made Olivia flinch. A flush of anger rose in her cheeks. No, she bit out. Not yet, anyway. But if I don't get that paycheck soon, I won't have much of a choice. Daniel exhaled through his nose. He was already checking his watch, already shifting back into the mindset of a CEO with more important things to do. I can call security. No. Olivia stepped forward, her voice firm. I told you. I worked here. I didn't steal anything. I didn't hurt anyone. And your first instinct is to call security? Daniel's jaw tensed. I don't know you. And I don't know you either, Olivia shot back, arms folding tightly across her chest. But let me guess. You're some rich executive who thinks anyone struggling must have done something wrong. Daniel's eyes sharpened. You think you know me? I know your type, she muttered. You sit in your fancy office making decisions that ruin people's lives and call it business. You've probably never spent a single day worrying about rent or where your next meal is coming from. A long silence followed. Then a sound cut through it. A low, unmistakable growl. Daniel's gaze flickered downward, toward her stomach, where Olivia's arms had instinctively wrapped around herself. He saw it now. The exhaustion, the hunger, the way her body swayed slightly, like standing, was taking more effort than it should. For the first time since he stepped into the room, Daniel hesitated. His hand hovered over his phone, still considering security. But something in his expression changed. He didn't press the button. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his gray eyes locked on hers. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Wolfe didn't know what to do. The rain came down in a relentless drizzle, turning the city into a blur of gray and silver. Olivia Hart pulled her oversized sweater tighter around herself, but it did little to stop the damp cold from seeping into her bones. The city had always been a machine, efficient, ruthless. But tonight, it felt like it was swallowing her whole. She walked with no real destination, just moving for the sake of moving. The rain-slick streets were lined with towering buildings, their bright neon signs promising luxury she could no longer afford. People bustled past, some with umbrellas, some ducking into sleek black cars. No one spared her a glance. No one ever did. Her stomach twisted, not just from hunger, though that was certainly there, but from the sheer weight of everything. A week ago, she had a job, an apartment she could afford, a future that, while not perfect, at least made sense. Now, she had nothing but a delayed paycheck, dwindling options, and the bitter taste of desperation on her tongue. She needed a job. Any job. Which was how she found herself standing outside Harper's Cafe, one of the city's busiest coffee shops. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm, and the smell of coffee alone made her stomach ache with longing. She could do this. A job was a job. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The warmth hit her instantly, the air thick with the scent of espresso and fresh pastries. A handful of people sat at tables hunched over laptops or chatting in low murmurs. Olivia spotted the manager behind the counter, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Ron. She squared her shoulders and approached. "Excuse me," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Are you hiring?" Ron barely looked up. "No." Olivia clenched her jaw. "I'll take anything. Mornings, nights, weekends. I don't need much." Ron finally looked at her then, really looked at her. The damp sweater, the exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. His expression softened, but his answer didn't. "Sorry," he said, shaking his head. "We're not hiring right now." Olivia felt her stomach drop. "Please," she tried again, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Look, lady," Ron cut her off, a little more impatient this time. "I told you, we're not hiring. Maybe try somewhere else." The finality in his tone made something inside her cave in. She swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yeah," she mumbled. "Okay. Thanks anyway." She turned too fast, nearly knocking over a chair in her rush to leave. The second she stepped back out into the rain, she exhaled shakily, trying to keep it together. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, her breath uneven. She wasn't going to cry, not here, not over this. But the truth clawed at her. She was running out of options. And then she felt it. That presence. The same one from the boardroom, from the restroom. She didn't even have to turn around to know. Daniel Wolfe was standing behind her. She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face before finally glancing back. He was there, a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his expensive coat. The rain had already started to dampen the edges of his perfectly tailored suit. But if he cared, he didn't show it. His sharp gray eyes weren't cold this time, not exactly. They were calculating, watching. She crossed her arms. "What do you want, Wolfe?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "So now, I'm Wolfe," he mused. "No longer some rich guy who throws money at problems." She rolled her eyes, too tired to argue.
"Seriously, why are you here?"
He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze flickered to the cafe's glass door, the one she had just walked out of. "You were looking for a job," he said. Olivia stiffened. "Were you following me?" His lips twitched, almost like he was amused. "Trust me, you're not that interesting." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Charming." He ignored the sarcasm. "Come work for me." For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. What? I need an assistant, Daniel said simply, like it was just another business transaction. Temporary. Just for a few weeks. Olivia stared at him. You need an assistant, she repeated, incredulous. Don't you already have a dozen people running around doing your every command? They're incompetent. His tone was dry, as if that was explanation enough. She let out a sharp laugh. And let me guess. Daniel shrugged. I think you're desperate. Her expression hardened. She hated that he was right. She hated that she was desperate. But more than that, she hated the idea of working for him. No, she said firmly. I don't need your charity. Daniel's jaw clenched. It's not charity. It's a job. It's your job, she countered, which means I'd be working under you. That's how employment works, yes. His tone was infuriatingly even. Olivia exhaled sharply, running a hand through her damp hair. Look, I appreciate the... She stopped herself, gritting her teeth. No, she didn't appreciate it. Not one bit. I just don't want to work for you. Daniel tilted his head, studying her. She let out a dry laugh. Because I don't trust you. Something flickered in his gaze. Not anger. Something sharper. He stepped closer, his voice lower now. Or, he said slowly, because you don't trust yourself. Olivia stiffened. Excuse me. You're too proud to admit you need help, Daniel said, his eyes locked onto hers. So instead you push people away. You refuse anything that doesn't come on your terms, even when it's in your best interest. Her nails dug into her palms. You don't know a damn thing about me. I know enough. Her breath hitched. He wasn't wrong, and that was the worst part. Daniel inhaled slowly, his patience thinning. Fine, he said. Let me put it this way. You need money. I need someone competent. I don't care if you like me. I don't care if you like me. Take the job or don't. But stop pretending this is about morals when it's just your pride talking. Olivia's fists clenched at her sides. She could say no. She could walk away. But where would she go? The thought made her stomach twist. She lifted her gaze, meeting his cold, unyielding stare. Fine, she muttered. Daniel didn't flinch. Trust me, he said dryly. I never expected you to be grateful. Olivia's first morning at Wolf Enterprises was exactly what she expected. Hell, she had barely stepped into the sleek, glass-walled office space when Daniel Wolf's sharp, clipped voice cut through the air like a blade. You're late. She glanced at the oversized clock mounted on the wall. 8:02 a.m. Olivia let out a slow breath, already regretting every life decision that had led her to this moment. Are you seriously mad about 2 minutes? Daniel didn't even look up from his laptop. Yes. Her teeth clenched. She had known working for him would be brutal, but this was already ridiculous. She forced a tight-lipped smile and dropped her bag onto the desk that was, apparently, hers now. Good morning to you too, boss. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, gray eyes as cold as steel. If I wanted pointless small talk, I wouldn't have hired you. Olivia exhaled sharply, counting to 3 before she said something that would get her fired. Instead, she folded her arms and leaned against his desk. Would it kill you to act like a human being for 5 seconds? Daniel arched a brow. Oh, he was going to be insufferable. She straightened, already feeling the weight of this terrible decision. Fine. What do you need? Daniel barely glanced at her as he continued typing. Cancel my 10 a.m. meeting with the investment firm. Reschedule it for next week. Olivia raised an eyebrow. You do realize I don't have access to your calendar yet, right? His fingers paused on the keyboard. He let out an exasperated sigh before turning the laptop toward her. Figure it out. Olivia stared at him for a long moment. This man, this insufferable, arrogant, control freak of a man. But fine, two could play this game. She pulled the laptop closer, fingers flying across the keyboard as she navigated through his system. 30 seconds later, she looked up. Done. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That fast? Olivia smirked. Told you I was competent. He studied her for a brief moment, then gave a short nod before returning to his work. No praise. No good job. Just a nod. Typical. Typical. The longer she worked with Daniel Wolf, the more infuriatingly predictable he became. 7:30 a.m. Sharp. He walked into the office, not a single hair out of place. His suit always impeccably pressed. 8:00 a.m. He started working, barking orders with the efficiency of a military commander. 12:00 p.m. He skipped lunch every single day. And somehow, against all logic, Olivia was starting to keep up. She hated to admit it, but the work itself wasn't bad. She actually enjoyed the fast pace, the problem, solving the challenge of keeping up with a man who seemed to operate on an entirely different level than the rest of the world. But Daniel himself, still unbearable. It had been 3 days since she started, and already they had fought at least twice a day. The man was impossible. But then there were moments. Fleeting, barely, there moments where she caught a glimpse of something beneath the ice-cold exterior. Like tonight. It was 10:57 p.m., and she was still here. She had been dragged into staying late, something about an urgent business report that Daniel refused to send without triple-checking every last detail. At first, she had been annoyed, but now, as she glanced at him from across the office, she saw something different. Exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, but something deeper, a kind of weariness that no amount of money or power could fix. He was still typing, his expression unreadable, tension etched into his jaw. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. You ever think about taking a break? Daniel didn't even look up. This is a billion-dollar company. If I take a break, things fall apart. Olivia frowned. I think you just like controlling everything. He finally looked at her, eyes sharp. You say that like it's a bad thing. She held his gaze. It is. A brief silence stretched between them. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. You sound concerned, he said. Olivia scoffed, grabbing her bag. Don't get excited. I just don't want my boss dropping dead before I get paid. Daniel let out a short, amused breath. Noted, and for some reason that small moment, the first crack in the armor, stayed with her. Because maybe, just maybe, Daniel Wolf wasn't as unshakable as he pretended to be. The days at Wolf Enterprises blurred together in a whirlwind of impossible deadlines, late-night reports, and the constant, exhausting presence of Daniel Wolf. Olivia had always known working for him would be a nightmare, but she hadn't realized it would be this bad. He was relentless, pushing her to her limits with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything. Every day, she went home drained, only to wake up and do it all over again. And yet, she was keeping up. More than that, she was thriving. She had expected to hate every second of this job. But the truth was, she liked the challenge. She liked the rush of solving problems before Daniel even had to ask, of predicting his needs before he voiced them. It was like playing a high-stakes game, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. The only problem, Daniel Wolf was still an unbearable control freak. "Where's the revised budget proposal?" Daniel's voice cut through the quiet office, sharp as ever. Olivia didn't look up from her laptop. "On your desk." A pause. The sound of papers shifting. "You already updated the figures?" She smirked. "Hours ago." Daniel walked past her desk, his sharp gaze scanning the document. He didn't say anything, but she could feel his approval. Not that he'd ever admit it. Instead, he set the report down and moved on. "Reschedule my lunch with the Sterling investors. Push it to next week." Olivia arched a brow. "You do realize you never actually scheduled a lunch with them in the first place, right?" Daniel stopped, turned. His eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger, more like curiosity. "Then why did you have their assistant reach out this morning?" She pressed, arms crossing. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" A slow exhale, the kind of exhale that meant he had just been caught underestimating her. She waited, and then, after a long moment, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Interesting. Interesting." He didn't like admitting she was right, but he respected that she was. That realization settled in her chest like a weight she wasn't ready to unpack. The more she worked with Daniel, the more she started seeing the cracks in his carefully constructed image. The late nights, the never-ending work, the way he never stopped moving, as if slowing down, even for a second, wasn't an option. She wasn't sure why, but it bothered her. Which was why, late that night, after hours of working in the near-empty office, she found herself blurting out, "Do you ever stop?" Daniel didn't look up from his laptop.
Hey! Excuse me.
She leaned back in her chair watching him. "You never leave before midnight. You don't eat lunch. Hell, I don't think I've even seen you drink water. Do you ever actually stop working?" His fingers paused over the keyboard. Then he glanced up, expression unreadable. "This is how you run a billion-dollar company," he said simply. Olivia frowned. "No, this is how you burn out." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You think I have the luxury of stopping?" She studied him, something tightening in her chest.
I think you don't know how.
Silence stretched between them. And for the first time, Daniel Wolf didn't have a response. The morning the scandal broke, Olivia knew something was wrong before she even stepped into the office. Wolf Enterprises was never quiet. The sleek, high-rise building was always alive with the hum of power, a machine running at full capacity. But today, the energy was different. The tension in the air was thick. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that clung to your skin like static before a storm. People whispered in frantic huddles, their faces pale. Phones rang off the hook. Screens flashed with breaking news alerts. And then she saw it. Daniel Wolf under investigation for insider trading. Her stomach dropped. Her feet carried her forward on instinct, past the sea of employees, pretending they weren't terrified, straight to Daniel's office. The door was already open. Inside, chaos. Stacks of documents, open reports, legal files scattered across his desk. The television mounted on the wall played a business news segment, the words fraud, illegal dealings, corporate corruption, blaring across the screen like a death sentence. And in the center of it all stood Daniel. His back was to her, his posture rigid, hands braced against his desk. His suit was still impeccable, because of course it was. But there was something different. Something off. She'd never seen him like this before. Daniel. Daniel, he didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge her at all. She took a step forward. Tell me what's going on. Finally, he exhaled, slow and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, like he was barely holding something back. They're saying I signed off on fraudulent transactions. Olivia's pulse kicked up. That's impossible. You didn't, she said immediately. His head turned slightly, gray eyes flicking toward her. The weight in his gaze sent a chill down her spine. You're awfully sure about that. She met his stare. Because I know you. You're too much of a control freak to let something like this slip past you. A flicker of something, amusement, crossed his face, but it was gone just as fast. This isn't a mistake, he muttered, straightening. It's a setup. The words hit her like ice water. Someone inside Wolf Enterprises wanted him to fall. The thought made her stomach twist. Daniel grabbed a folder from his desk and flipped it open, shoving it toward her. Look at this. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the pages. Financial statements. Digital approvals. An executive signature at the bottom of each deal. His signature. Accept. Olivia's brows furrowed. Something was off. She leaned in, studying the details. The way the letters curved, the spacing. This isn't right, she murmured. Daniel folded his arms. Explain. She pointed to the signature. This looks like yours, but it's not. The pressure is different. The way the ink flows, the angle. It's off. Daniel stilled. His mind was already working through it, processing at that impossible speed of his. Someone forged my signature, he said. She nodded. Someone inside your company wanted this to happen. His jaw clenched. Someone framed him, and he had no idea who. Olivia didn't sleep that night. The moment she left Daniel's office, her mind had been racing. Someone inside Wolf Enterprises had forged his signature. Someone powerful enough to manipulate documents, shift millions without raising alarms, and make sure Daniel Wolf took the fall for it. And no one was talking. That fact alone made her skin crawl. So she did what she did best. She started digging. She spent hours poring over financial records, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that stood out. It wasn't easy. Wolf Enterprises was a labyrinth of transactions, contracts, and endless layers of bureaucracy. But Olivia had something most people didn't. Instinct. And her instincts told her that this wasn't just a random act of sabotage. This was planned by someone inside. And by 3 a.m, she had a name. Richard Crane. A senior executive, loyal, respected. A man who had worked under Daniel for years, long enough to know how to move beneath his radar. Olivia stared at the name on her screen, her pulse quickening. If she was right, if Crane had orchestrated this, then Daniel was about to be destroyed from the inside. She had to tell him. But she never got the chance. Because the moment she stepped outside her apartment that morning, a black car pulled up beside her. And before she could react, 2 men in dark suits stepped out. One grabbed her wrist. Stay out of this. Her breath caught. Panic flared in her chest as she yanked her arm back, but the man tightened his grip. You don't want to make this difficult, Miss Hart. Her heart hammered. This was real. She forced herself to stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about. The second man leaned in, voice low and chillingly polite. Drop whatever you're looking into. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they let go. Got back into the car. And disappeared. Leaving Olivia standing there, shaken, her wrist throbbing, her stomach twisting with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. A fear. Someone knew. And they were warning her. But they had made a mistake. Because if they thought she was just going to walk away, they didn't know Olivia Hart. Olivia barely made it to Wolf Enterprises before her legs gave out. She'd been running on adrenaline the entire way, her pulse hammering, her wrist still burning from where that man had grabbed her. Her mind screamed at her to calm down, to think, but all she could hear were his words, "Stay out of this." Not a warning, a threat. By the time she reached Daniel's office, her breath was uneven, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't knock. She just shoved the door open. Daniel was at his desk, suit crisp, phone in hand, sharp eyes locked onto a legal document. He didn't look up. "You'd better have something good," he said coolly. "I'm in no mood for—" "Someone just threatened me." That got his attention. His head snapped up, gaze sharpening instantly, dangerously. "What?" His voice dropped, low and controlled, but there was something lethal beneath it. Olivia stepped forward, throwing her bag onto the chair, her heartbeat still too fast. "Two men. Black car. They told me to drop it. That I don't want to make this difficult." Daniel's entire body went rigid. "Did they touch you?" She hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she rolled up her sleeve, revealing the faint bruise blooming around her wrist. Daniel stilled. And then, in a single breath, something inside him snapped. He was on his feet in an instant, rounding the desk so fast Olivia barely had time to react. Before she could step back, his hand wrapped around her wrist, gentle but firm. His gaze darkened as he studied the bruise. His grip tightened. Not on her, on himself. His jaw clenched, his breath measured, his fury carefully contained. And for the first time, Olivia saw it, real, unfiltered rage. "Who did this to you?" His voice was low, deadly. She swallowed hard. "I don't know, but it's because of Crane." Daniel's eyes snapped to hers. "What?" She pulled her arm back, straightening. "I was up all night going through the financials. It's him, Daniel. Crane is the one who set you up." His entire expression darkened. Olivia rushed on. The signatures, the transactions, they all link back to him. "He must have forged your approval, but he covered his tracks well enough that no one questioned it. I don't think he expected me to." She stopped. Daniel's gaze had shifted, something unreadable flickering behind his sharp, furious eyes. "What?" she asked warily. "You shouldn't have done this alone." Her stomach twisted. "I couldn't just sit back and watch them ruin you." His expression flickered. And for the first time, Daniel Wolf didn't have a sharp retort. Olivia's chest was still heaving, her mind still spiraling. But there was something else in the air now, something heavier. The way he was looking at her. It was different. His fingers curled at his sides. "You're too damn reckless." "You're welcome," she shot back. He exhaled, slow and controlled, running a hand through his hair. "You have no idea how much danger you just put yourself in." "Yeah," she folded her arms. "I think I have a pretty good idea." Silence. And then, unexpectedly, frustratingly, Daniel let out a rough breath and laughed. A short, exhausted sound, like he couldn't believe her. She scowled. "What?" He shook his head, looking at her like she was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. "You don't listen to a damn thing I say? Do you?" "Nope," she said, popping the PE for emphasis. His lips twitched. And for the first time since this nightmare started, something between them shifted. The plan was simple. Expose Richard Crane, clear Daniel's name, and this. But simple didn't mean safe. Daniel had always been a strategist. Every move calculated, every risk measured. But now there was something different in his approach. He wasn't just playing to win, he was playing to destroy. And Olivia, she was right there with him. The two of them spent the next 24 hours unraveling everything. Every fraudulent deal, every altered document, every digital trace Crane had tried to erase. And with each discovery, it became painfully clear this wasn't just about money. It was personal. Crane had been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to strike. And Daniel had never seen it coming. By the time the shareholders' meeting arrived, the tension was a living, breathing thing. The kind of tension that made empires collapse. The boardroom was packed. Executives, investors, lawyers, everyone who mattered. And at the center of it all, Daniel Wolf. He sat at the head of the table, composed, unreadable. But Olivia, standing just behind him, saw the truth. Beneath the icy exterior, he was seething. Crane was seated across from him, perfectly relaxed, his expensive suit crisp, his smile polite. He thought he had won. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Daniel leaned forward, fingers steepled. Before we begin, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Crane tilted his head, feigning curiosity.
Something wrong, Daniel?
Daniel didn't blink. You tell me. Crane chuckled, shaking his head. If this is about the investigation, I assure you, we all have questions. But the evidence is there. He gestured toward the legal team. It's unfortunate, but you signed those contracts. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then, with devastating precision, he slid a folder across the table. Crane hesitated. The room stilled. What's this? Crane asked. Daniel's voice was lethal. Proof. Crane's fingers twitched as he opened the folder. And then, his face changed. A flicker of something. Panic. Daniel didn't give him a chance to recover. That's a full audit of the transactions in question, he said smoothly, including a forensic analysis of the digital signatures used to approve them. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Olivia watched as Crane's jaw tightened. His eyes darted over the documents, looking for an escape. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Daniel leaned back. I never signed those contracts, Richard. His voice was calm, measured. Dangerous. But you already knew that, didn't you? Crane swallowed. This is ridiculous. It's over. Daniel's words cut through the room like a blade. And then, as if on cue, the doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped inside. SEC agents. The color drained from Crane's face. Daniel barely glanced at them. Mr. Crane has a few things to answer for. The agents moved forward. Crane shot up from his chair. This is a setup. No, Daniel said, standing. This is justice. A second later, Richard Crane was escorted out in handcuffs. And just like that, it was over. The room was still spinning with shock, but Daniel Wolf was already walking away. And Olivia? She was right beside him. The fallout was swift. By the next morning, Richard Crane was gone. His name wiped from Wolf Enterprises like he had never existed. The headlines were ruthless. Senior executive arrested in corporate fraud scandal. Wolf Enterprises cleared of allegations. The company's stock rebounded. Investors stopped panicking. And Daniel Wolf. He had won. But as Olivia watched him sit at his desk that evening, staring at nothing in particular, she realized something. It didn't feel like a victory. Not to him. For the past few weeks, Daniel had been fighting a war. But now that it was over, now that the dust had settled, he wasn't celebrating. He was just there, a man who had spent so long building, only to realize that he had almost lost everything. And for the first time, she saw it. The exhaustion he never acknowledged, the weight of a company that had nearly slipped through his fingers, the silence that came when there was no longer an enemy to fight. It wasn't relief. It was emptiness. Olivia knew that feeling well. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. This was it. Her job here was done. She had survived. She had helped clear his name. She was free. So why did the thought of walking away feel so damn heavy? She swallowed hard and took a step toward the door. But before she could leave, Daniel's voice cut through the quiet. "You're leaving." She stopped. Turned. He was still looking at his desk, his fingers drumming against the surface in an almost restless rhythm. She forced a shrug. Yeah. His jaw tightened. She hesitated. "That's what you wanted, right?" A long silence. And then, soft, almost too quiet, "I don't know," that made her chest tighten. She tried to ignore it. "I should go." Another pause. Then, finally, he looked at her. And for the first time, Daniel Wolf didn't look like a CEO. He just looked like a man who wasn't ready to let her go. "Thank you," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "What?" His gaze didn't waver. "For saving my company." She let out a soft, humorless laugh.
I didn't do it for you.
Daniel tilted his head slightly. "No?" She swallowed. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Silence stretched between them. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, Daniel stood and closed the distance between them. Slowly, deliberately, until she could feel the warmth of him, until his presence was all consuming. And when he spoke, his voice was different, lower, rougher. "I should have listened to you." She hated how much her heart reacted to that. She shook her head. "Doesn't matter now." "It does." His voice was too steady, too real. And suddenly, she couldn't breathe. He exhaled, his fingers flexing like he wanted to reach for her. Like he wanted to keep her here. Olivia. She hated the way her name sounded coming from him. Like it meant something. She forced herself to look away. Because if she didn't, she wasn't sure she'd be able to leave at all. A week passed. 7 days of silence. 168 hours of waiting. For a call, for a message, for something. But Olivia never reached out. And Daniel Wolf hated how much that fact unsettled him. He had spent his entire life moving forward, winning. He had built an empire by refusing to hesitate, refusing to look back. Yet here he was, standing in front of a dimly lit cafe, watching through the rain, streaked window as Olivia Hart sat alone. Her coffee had gone cold. She wasn't drinking it. Instead, she sat there, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. And Daniel knew.
She was thinking about him.
Just like he had been thinking about her. He stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed softly. Olivia didn't notice. Not at first. Then, as if sensing him, she lifted her head. Her breath caught. Daniel didn't move. Didn't blink. He just watched as every emotion flashed across her face. Shock, hesitation, and something deeper. Something vulnerable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice quiet. Daniel inhaled slowly. Then, steadily, "Looking for you." A beat. Then another. Olivia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Daniel, I love you. She froze. The words hit her harder than any argument they'd ever had. She searched his face, waiting for the smirk, the sarcasm. Some sign that he wasn't serious. But there was nothing but certainty. Her chest tightened. You don't mean that. His gaze didn't waver. I do. You're just saying that because I helped you? No. His voice was firm. This isn't about what you did for me. It's about what you are to me. She hated how much she wanted to believe him. But fear was louder. She shook her head, pushing back from the table. You don't do love, Daniel. You do control. You do strategy. You don't. You. The word stopped her. He stepped closer, voice lower now, rougher. You were never part of the plan. Her heart slammed against her ribs. I don't chase things, Olivia. He exhaled sharply. I never have. She knew that. He was a man who had built everything: power, wealth, reputation. But she was the one thing he hadn't built. She was the one thing that had happened anyway. And suddenly, none of it mattered anymore. Not her fear. Not her pride. Not the walls she had spent years building around herself. Because he was standing here, choosing her. And for the first time, Olivia let herself believe it. So, she did the only thing she could. She ran to him. Olivia crashed into him, arms wrapping around his neck, fingers gripping the fabric of his rain-dampened coat, like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. Daniel barely had time to react before instinct took over. His hands found her waist, pulling her against him, anchoring her to the moment. The cafe around them disappeared. All he could feel was the warmth of her body, the rapid rise and fall of her breath, the way she fit so perfectly against him. Like this was always supposed to happen, like he had been waiting for it. She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her hazel eyes burning. You're an idiot, she muttered. His lips curved. And you're impossible. Then, finally, she kissed him. And Daniel Wolfe, for the first time in his life, let himself fall. The rain had stopped by the time they left the cafe, but the world still felt different. Or maybe it was just them. They walked in silence, side by side, as the city stretched out before them, bright and alive, like it was witnessing something neither of them had fully grasped yet. Olivia exhaled, shaking her head. I still don't know what to do with you. Daniel smirked.
I don't need you to do anything.
She arched a brow.
Oh, so now you're easygoing?
He let out a low chuckle. Her lips twitched. Didn't think so. Another silence. Then, quieter, softer. What now? She asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. Stay. Her steps slowed. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. He reached for her hand, slowly, deliberately, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers curled around hers, firm and steady. I don't know how to do this, Olivia. She swallowed hard. Neither do I. He exhaled, his grip tightening just slightly. Then, let's figure it out together. A long beat. Then, finally, she nodded. Okay. Daniel Wolfe had spent his entire life chasing success, power, control. And for the longest time, he thought that was enough. Then, Olivia Hart had walked into his world and ruined it, changed it, made him realize that none of it mattered without her. And as they stood there, hands intertwined, city lights flickering around them, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Lessons from the story. At its core, this story isn't just about power, betrayal, or corporate battles. It's about transformation. It's about how life has a way of breaking down even the most unshakable people, forcing them to face what truly matters. For Daniel Wolfe, success was everything. He built his empire by being ruthless, by believing that control was the key to survival. But control means nothing when you have no one to share your victories with. It took losing everything, and almost losing Olivia, for him to understand that power isn't the ultimate goal. Love, trust, and having someone who challenges you, who sees beyond your armor, is what truly matters. For Olivia Hart, pride was both her greatest strength and her biggest weakness. She refused to accept help, refused to believe that someone like Daniel could genuinely care for her. But strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to let someone in, learning to trust, to take a leap even when fear tells you to run, is just as powerful as fighting to survive. This story reminds us that success without connection is empty, that true power comes not from control, but from allowing yourself to be vulnerable. And sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places. Lie, in the middle of a war you never meant to fight. What about you? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another soul-stirring story. Until next time, believe in love, in change, and in the power of a single moment to transform everything.